My mother's family lived for many generations. And when I was 5 years old, the family moved to Reichenberg, which was the capital of Sudeten. That is the part of Czechoslovakia that adjoins Germany. And I grew up in a town that was 95% German.
What year did you move?
We moved around either 28 or 29. And I started school there. We moved, I think, in January, and I started school in fall. And I went to German school. The Jews in that part of the world had a great admiration for German culture, so they put their children into German schools, although there were Czech schools there.
What made your family decide to move from Rudnik?
It's a real, you see, I have my origins deep in the shtetl. They, when I think of my mother's fate, I still hurt. I'm going to be 61 years old tomorrow. And every time I think of her life, it just overwhelms me with pain, because she went through both world wars and had the brunt of it in the First World War and in the Second World War. She was a refugee in Reichenberg during the First World War. And then her father died when she was only 17 years old, so she fled with her mother and sister and brother to Reichenberg, which was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so it was the same country. And she was there as a refugee, and after the war they returned. But it was an eye-opener to her. This was a Western country, very clean, German clean, and prosperous. It was a textile center. It was very beautifully located in the mountains. And she went back to please her mother, who felt it was what she called a Trefermukum, a Trefer place where they couldn't be really religious. And she brought them back to Rudnik, where there was a typhoid epidemic and extreme poverty, but she had to be back in her shtetl. But my mother yearned for this Reichenberg throughout her life, but she lived, well, until she fulfilled her dream. She got married in Rudnik. My father came from Yaroslav. And they lived the way they lived in the shtetl. In poverty, they had a little store. My father sat and learned all day, and she was in the store, and she was sewing shirts. She was more enterprising than others, and she had learned how to sew in Reichenberg when she was sewing uniforms for the army of the First World War. So she would sew shirts, and she did a little better than most, but it was still, having had experience in Reichenberg, she was never satisfied anymore. And she was agitating to leave. I think that it was a blow to my father, because my father was a scholar, and he had his friends in the shtetl. He had his rabbi, and I think this was a life that suited him. But her dissatisfaction and the circumstance that combined, namely that things got worse, finally brought it to a point. Also, a lot of people from that shtetl, a handful actually, from that shtetl had remained in Reichenberg and become very prosperous. So when one of them, a man by the name of Ehrlich, who was a distant relative, came to visit and saw my mother and her family live in the typical shtetl poverty, he said, if your husband would just agree to become a shochet, a ritual slaughterer, we would have a job for him and you could come to Reichenberg. But they didn't have any papers. In the end, my mother left and smuggled across the border to Reichenberg in order to provide papers for my husband, passport and things. And
for your father?
For my father. My father, in the meantime, studied Shrita, the ritual slaughtering, and all the Talmudic learning that went with it. This year was fateful for us because I became a mother that year. I was 4 years old, and I was responsible for my sister. And I think this plays into the Holocaust years too, because throughout the Holocaust years I was responsible for the family.
How old was your sister then?
She was 2.5 years younger. She was really an infant. And on the rare occasion when a car passed through Rudnik, she almost went under the car. And I felt intensely personally responsible for it. It was really... But even worse, my mother suffered so from longing and from loneliness in Reichenberg. But she did very well there. When we came a year later, she had an apartment all furnished. And we lived in Reichenberg from then on, which made her happier because we didn't have any want there. We were very comfortable. There were no poor people in the Jewish community in Reichenberg, but my father was in exile. What I'm saying is what I pieced together hearing in the family, because I was never back to Poland. I didn't know my relatives. We lived in Reichenberg until the Holocaust. And the only time I saw my father socially stimulated is when the Schnorrers came to town, the Orchem. They always came to our house, and then they would talk, and study together. And I think they did more for him than he did for them. And I always felt very sorry for my father. Being a shochet was a total misfit. He did it because he had to. And I remember once my mother saying that the first time he went and he had to kill a calf, he came home crying that the calf had licked his hands. He was a very gentle, very sensitive man, very sensitive to the children, and just made of very fine cloth. He had 4 brothers and 2 stepbrothers, and they were all very scholarly. He came from a very edel background, very thin-skinned and intellectual. That's how we got to Reichenberg. Now, I went to German school there, as I said, because we had great admiration for German culture. And also in the city, the 5% Czechs were of a lower class. They were the craftsmen, the shoemakers and the tailors and the manual laborers. The Germans ran the town, and there were about 5 huge palatial German schools and 1 wooden Czech school, where I ended up in around 37, because by that time anti-Semitism was so rampant that I couldn't stay in German school.
Did you know German when you got to Reichenberg?
Not a word. When I came to school, I didn't know anything. I knew Yiddish.
Yiddish was spoken at home?
Yes. Although my parents knew German, they may have spoken with an accent, but they knew German well.
Where did the other Jewish children go to school?
All went to German school, but there were so few Jews. My father's community consisted of 17 Orthodox Jews, all doing extremely well, and they all went to German school. But sometimes there were years when I was the only Jewish child in the class, and learning came rather easily to me, but I was aware of intense anti-Semitism.
What was going on that made you aware of that? What was happening?
Well, in the beginning, it was just that when my father went on the street and he wore a black kaftan and a hat and he had payas and a beard, the kids would tease him and call after him. But he felt that he was in the Democratic Republic of Czechoslovakia and reprimanded the teacher, which embarrassed me no end. Told the teacher to keep his charges in line, which was, it was such It was very embarrassing to stand out like this. Although I admired it, it was painful. Also, there was this constant business about Sabbath observing. I had to go to school on the Sabbath. And I wouldn't write. And then I didn't come on holidays. And this became an occasion for a display of anti-Semitism, you know. Teacher would ridicule me, and my father would write a letter, and I took the letter to the Oberlehrer, you know, to the principal. And it was just torture. Then when I was 12 years old, I couldn't carry anymore on the Sabbath. So I would bring my school, but I always went to school on the Sabbath. You had to go on Saturday. I would bring my school bag to school and leave it with a janitor. This was a weekly occurrence. And leave it with the janitor. And then when I came to school, I had to start looking for the janitor to find my school bag. And by the time I found him, I would come into class late, whereupon the teacher would stop the whole class and ridicule me, and how I'd come late, and what was this again, some Israelitic exploit, and so on. This was a weekly. Every time I used to think during the week about going to school on Saturday, I used to get a cramp in my stomach. And yet I adored going to school. I love learning. I'm still going to school. I'm always in school. It's contrary to all our psychological insights. Anybody who would be traumatized like this in our schools, you'd expect him to drop out. No, I'm going on. I'm going to school. I'm a doctoral candidate now. I'm supposed to write my dissertation this summer. I have never been out of school. And yet it was so painful and so humiliating. Well, as I went through elementary, I only went to school until I was 15, then I was thrown out. But as I went through elementary school, there was a fifth column of the Nazi party in that town. It was a headquarters for Henlein. You may not be familiar with that name, but he was the leader of the Sudetendeutsche. And it became more and more strident. My classmates were in uniform, marching around the school singing Heute gehört uns die Heimat, you know, the German song Tomorrow the Whole World. And they, it wasn't really, it was getting worse. The worst of it, as I dated, there's very special Shabbos when we came to synagogue, and a man burst in who was black and blue. He had been beaten by the Nazis across the border, and he had smuggled across the border and made his way to our synagogue. And then I saw it. I had known it, but then I saw it. And then he was there with the whole family. The community took them in, children and everything, and he stayed in Reichenberg. And finally made his way to America, unlike most of the others who were there. But he was already on the run, so he had momentum.
Mm-hmm. This was around what year?
Was around 35, 34. Mm-hmm. I was about 10 years old when this happened.
What was made in the family of the anti-Semitism experiences you were having?
You see, anti-Semitism was the given in their experience. My mother used to tell me that when she went to Polish school, the kids would pull at her pigtails and hurt her, and she would come home bleeding. And her mother would say, "You're perfectly all right, it's going to heal. Forget it." And so if I complained, they sang this song or they called after me. She said, "So, where are you bleeding?" That was her question. What's happening? You have everything. That's the way Goyim are. That was the given. But then it became different.
Were there any children who were your friends in the German school? Or
it was very interesting. I was like at the top of the class, so I made friends by helping. And I also always had one or two kids who would walk home with me, but we never went to each other's homes. It was like an outdoor relationship. It never came indoors. I have particularly painful memories about one girl whose name was Hildegard Löffler. I remember her so clearly. She was my best friend. I even went to her house, and she came to me sometimes. She was very sensitive and very talented, gifted child. And what I remember, I really loved her. She sat next to me in class when we were very little, and it was winter, and this was a mountain landscape where we lived, and the teacher gave us a piece of paper and crayons and said we should draw a snow scene. And I have no ability to draw whatsoever, but when they tell you in a German school to draw, you draw. So I was drawing, and then out of the corner of my eye, I saw what she was doing. Not only did she draw beautifully, but she drew a mountain, and the snow was a pale lilac. And I was just about to open up my mouth and whisper, "Hey, snow is not lilac," when suddenly something happened to me. It was like the birth of my aesthetic sensitivity. I suddenly knew that the snow was lilac at a certain time of day. And that's how clearly she had it. My eyes were opened. It was like I can date all my subsequent visual sensitivity, my feeling for art from that moment. It was like a revelation. And that's the kind of girl she was. One day, I walked to school, and I thought I'd meet Hildegard. And she walked by me in a Nazi uniform, and she cut me dead. She made believe she didn't know me. I mean, I have experienced a lot of things since then, but it was just devastating. It was a preview of coming attractions. She never spoke to me again, nor ever looked me in the face. And also at that time, there was a book in our house called the Brown Book. If you're a student of the Holocaust, I'm sure you came across the Brown Book. It was a visual record of Nazi atrocities in the first years, like 33, 34. And you had pictures of people beaten black and blue, and very exact dates documented very carefully. And my parents would look at this book, and then the book was, and I wouldn't go to sleep if the book was in the room. I would cry, I can't go to sleep if the book is in the room. And that was long before that happened.
When she walked by you and ignored you, did you call out to her?
I said, "Hello?" She walked straight down. I understood immediately.
You understood?
Oh, yeah. I understood immediately because there were so many others marching around, but it couldn't be Hildegard because I still remember her. She was so fine and so sensitive, and we had so many things in common that other girls didn't understand, like about snow being purple. And we understood things together. And she had some awareness of pain. Her mother had a goiter, and her father was poor. She had some special sensitivity. She was gone. And all this time, my parents were Polish citizens because it took years and years to get Czech citizenship. So that we lived on sufferance. Every few months you had to go and have your citizenship, your stay extended. What made it even worse is that to my mother, the prospect of having to go back to Poland was like being executed. She hated that country with such a passion. She had such terrible memories because my mother was a spirited woman and with a great sense of justice. She couldn't even pay a false compliment. There was absolutely no artifice in her. And the way they had treated them in Poland aroused such an anger and such a rejection in her that she never went back to see her mother or her brother and sister. She was afraid, coming with a Polish passport, maybe they would detain her. My father went to visit his father's grave. My mother never went back. So every time, every 3 months, sometimes 6 months, when you had to go back for your extension of the Aufenthaltsbewilligung, the permission to stay in the country, there was a crisis in the house. I must say also about my father that I think he had a sense that he betrayed his religion by leaving Poland. Although our household in Reichenberg could have been transported back to Poland without any adjustments. That's how strict an observance it was. I didn't wear short sleeves until after the war, and we were strictly brought up. But he felt maybe he wouldn't quite comply, and he must have made a deal with God that he was going to make up for it by supporting his family. And throughout our stay in Reichenberg, he sent money to Poland every second week. That was such a holy ritual that I sort of mark my adulthood, the equivalent of a bas mitzvah, that I was permitted to go to the post office and send the money. And once I didn't behave, I must have done something awful. I don't know what I did. I have completely blocked out my misdeed. But my father pulled himself up and said, "I am so upset. I don't think you're worthy to go to the post office," which totally demolished me. I cried for hours. I remember sobbing and crying myself to sleep. Not only did my grandmother live on that money, the whole extended family, there are people here in New York who lived on that money. He regularly supported them. But when these 3 months came, or the 6 months period came, they all were aware of it because their livelihood might stop. So they were wishes and prayers, and they went to the rabbi so that we could remain in Reichenberg. One of the things that came up during those periodic requests to remain in Reichenberg is that we were in German school. You send your children to German school. You mean, things were pretty hot by now. The Czechs were massing soldiers in the area. We thought there would be a war. I'm anticipating. You see, now I'm getting my dates mixed up. But about around that time, my parents felt if it was going to help them get their Aufenthaltsbewilligung, their permission to stay, they don't put us into Czech school. So unceremoniously, 1 September, I was put into Czech school. I didn't understand a word. I didn't know how to say hello. I had never seen any Czechs, except I heard some people talking funny on the street sometimes. I didn't know how to ask how to get to the toilet. And there I sat like as if I was totally deaf. I didn't understand anything. The only thing I gradually started to understand is that they called me German. The way they used to call me the Jew in the German school, now they called me Niemka. They never referred to me the name, but Niemka. So that was the new school.
What grade was this event?
I would say in 6th grade, maybe 7th.
And you weren't consulted, your parents made this decision?
Well, there would have been no question. I mean, our existence seemed to depend on me going to Czech school, so you go to Czech school.
Were the Czechs aware that you were Jewish, and did they have any feeling about that? Or were they...
They were. So at one time when I started understanding, which went very quickly, I had a particular flair for languages. She's the teacher, one of the real fierce biddies, said to the whole class, "These people," meaning the Jews, "never had any interest in us. Now when the Germans are on their tail, they come to us." And that was a repetitive theme, that we only came to them. The ironic part of it was, I remember doing a composition with a dictionary, where I wrote my composition in German, then translated it with a dictionary, and it made no sense at all. There wasn't one sentence that was intelligible. and there was a lot made of it. Later on, when I looked at the composition 2 months later, it was totally nonsensical. Every word was picked out of the dictionary. Of course, that can't be done. But at the end of the year, I had the stellar role in the play, and I recited. Somebody called Jirasek. It won't mean anything to you, but he was the most patriotic Czech. And there was an ode to the homeland, which was long and convoluted, and the only one who could remember it was me, so I got the role. And my parents stood there, not understanding a word. It was very weird. It was very confusing. I was in the Christmas play. I was Mary, and that I didn't tell my parents. So, all kind of twilight, intercultural, between cultural existence. You know, I'm now an expert in gifted education, and this is supposed to be the optimal environment for developing giftedness, to have contact with different different cultural scenes, different points of view, different reference. Boy, did I have it. And then I remember there was a broadcast. I mean, Hitler was getting shriller and shriller how he was going to liberate the Volksdeutsche, these Germans across the border. And they were totally organized. The Czechs fought back very limply because they were so committed to democracy. So they had German policemen in town. All the law and order was preserved by Germans. In the 11th hour, they brought in Czech policemen and removed the Germans. The Czechs didn't know how to speak to 95% of the population. And then Hitler became shriller and shriller, and then I remember one Motzei Shabbat, after Sabbath was out, we stood on the street, and there was a broadcast on the street, and I held my mother's hand, and my sister held my father's hand, and the Jews were clustered, and I mean the population was clustered, the Jews were in one place, and Hitler was shouting that, I don't know who he referred to, was einsam und verlassen, was alone and deserted, but his brethren across the border, meaning our country, our town, was not einsam und verlassen, was neither alone nor deserted. He was going to liberate them, and that was, we believed it then. I know that we believed it, that this is the end of our stay in Reichenberg. I couldn't go to school anymore, so my parents put me into eine Sprachenschule, a language school, where I learned English for 6 weeks.
You couldn't go to school anymore, to the Czech school either?
It was there was martial law. You couldn't go to school anymore. I went to this school one morning, and in the central square where City Hall was, a very beautiful square, there were policemen on horseback, and I was going with a boy, and the policemen separated us. You couldn't be with anybody. That constituted assembly, apparently, and they were galloping around the square, separating people. Couldn't go with anybody. And when I came home, my parents were packing. And what do you pack? How do you pack? You have to go. And packing, leaving at this point, constituted a betrayal of the Czech democracy. The Czechs were furious because you weren't supposed to leave. Again, the split loyalties, the confusion. You were not supposed to leave. You want to make a stand and fight the Germans. That was really taken. It's hard to integrate it now, but that was really taken seriously as I understood it. They were massing soldiers on the border. We were the border. This was the major city there, and they were going to fight for their homeland, and we betrayed, as usual. The Jews were running. You know, good Czech would have stayed and fought. And we were packing. And I don't know if it came across to you what kind of a child I was. I was extremely bookish. I was very frustrating to my mother because I never heard when she called me because I was reading. I was supposed to be exceedingly intelligent and dumb at the same time, impractical. Like I had no common sense. That was my sister had all the common sense and I only had intelligence. And my father would say, oh, if only this were a boy. When I would talk to him, you know, a son would have been great. And my mother would say, who is going to marry a girl like that? The books and the languages, and she was very frustrated. And when I think of how we left Reichenberg, this will best present to you the frustration and what was going on in the house. I had a favorite uncle, the only uncle I knew, my father's youngest brother, who, by the way, the only one who came out of the Holocaust, who died here. And he went on a trip, and he always brought me presents. He didn't have any use for my sister. I was his kind of child. We were kindred souls. And he brought me a book, a big, heavy art book by The History of Art by Gobineau. I only checked it out about 10 years ago, whether that really existed or whether I had made that up in my fantasy, but there is a History of Art by Gobineau. And it had beautiful illustrations of art, a few hundred years of art. And there was this scene with my parents packing, and they were taking their bedding and sausages and stuff that you could keep, because we didn't know where we were going. We were going to make our way to Prague, but what happened there we didn't know. And I was supposed to carry sausages, and my sister was already loaded with sausages, and there was a lot of clothes, and I took the clothes, and then I made a stand on the sausages. I was going to take the Gobineau, and the Gobineau was heavy and big, and my mother flipped. And I stood there. I wasn't going to go. I'm not leaving without the Gobineau. And in the end, my father understood, because I saw him go over to my mother. And I heard about this kind, you know, the child, and I was permitted to go with the Gobineau. I must have looked like a damn fool in that railroad car where everybody carried food and packages, you know, and bedding, and I carried this huge art book. And then we came to Prague. And we arrived in the middle of the night, and on that night, 100,000 Jews came to Prague. And there was absolutely no place to go. So we tried to bed down in the railroad station. And then somebody from our town who had preceded us, who was a little livelier than we were and had preceded us to Prague, saw us sitting there. And my father commanded a lot of respect. He had a certain, in his gentle way, even in concentration camp, very uncouth people would take his broom away when it was his turn to sweep the barracks or something like that. They couldn't stand that. So this man came up to him and greeted him and said, I'm leaving. This isn't safe here. I'm going off. I don't know where he's going. He's going to Poland, probably. That was safe. And I have a hotel room, and it's yours. And we had a hotel room. So it was a tiny little room, and 2 beds, and my mother and her sister and I slept in one bed, my father in the other bed. And that's where we stayed for weeks until we found, yeah, that's another thing. In Prague, I got the Czech papers from my parents. I was big enough, I was older, and I knew Czech. And I went from office to office until I got those papers. And I actually, by a young man with whom I must have appealed to as a girl, there's no other reason, who circumvented some red tape and actually handed me our citizenship papers. All that struggle of 10 years of extension, there it was. In a way that saved our lives, because now we were Czech citizens. And the Polish citizens in Prague were persecuted and deported, and they reached the ghettos of Lodz much quicker than we did, and of course time is survival at this point. And in the meantime, we had to find a place to live, and there was a German family who had fled from Saarbrücken, and they had rented, before this influx of the 100,000 people, they had rented an apartment in the ghetto area, and there were about 6 rooms. In every room there was a family, and that's what they lived on. I mean, we paid rent, and that supported this family. So we had 1 room. And every week or so there was a raid where the Czech gendarmes would pounce in looking for Polish citizens or other aliens to deport them. And then we children would get up, and they would march in and search through the rooms, and you had to produce your papers. It was like this a habitual nightmare. Within a few weeks, we started looking for an apartment, and we found one in Ulice Eliške Krasnohorske 9. It's named after a poet, and it was near the old synagogue. And one morning we woke up, and it was a narrow street, and the house was hundreds of years old and was beautiful. Looked out the window, and across the street the whole window was hung with a swastika. The Germans had marched into Prague. That was in 1938, before the Anschluss. The whole street was hung with swastikas. The whole town. And it was quiet like a grave. Nobody walked out. There wasn't even any sound of celebration. It was quiet. It was like dead. We settled down to that too. This was 1938. We were not deported until 1942. Gradually, the Jews were allowed to live only in the ghetto, and it happened that this was within the radius of the apartment, so we stayed there, but in every room there was a family.
When the swastikas were put up, did you have a sense then that you were in imminent danger, or what was your...
I don't think you thought we would be killed. But we felt we were in imminent danger of going to labor camps or having our property confiscated, maybe being beaten up. I think that the terror, the awareness sneaked up on us gradually. My first concern was that I couldn't go to school. What the hell was going to become of me? I wasn't in school. I felt I had no other ability or vocation than to go to school. And there was no way I could go to school. My sister went to a Jewish school for a while. The Jewish school was still open. I was too old for that. It was only elementary school. I should have been in first year in high school or second year in high school. So but the thing was, we thought, how long can it last? I mean, he's going to be defeated. As long as we're home, this is just a passing thing. How long could Hitler last? I mean, really. So, at first, the concern was not to use up your money. Nobody was earning. So, believe it or not, having had 6 weeks of English instruction, I became an English teacher. It was clear to the whole family that I should make a living. Who else was going to do it? They didn't speak Czech, and who needs a shochet? My mother didn't know Czech. My sister was little. So I gave English lessons while I was trying to upgrade my English. Then I learned, then they said, if we immigrate, it will be either to an English or Spanish-speaking country. So I had a few weeks of Spanish lessons from a salesman of Batya, which was a shoe concern, who had a job in Barcelona. That was the extent of my Spanish instruction. But I went a long way. I passed my Spanish in college without any difficulty. For the rest, I had to learn to do something. So they sent me to learn how to sew corsets, which was weird because I couldn't learn how to run the machine. I always went backwards. I mastered it after a while, but I showed no aptitude, but I knew how to fit well. So ultimately, I made a living sewing corsets and giving English lessons while I was having a romance and while I was making as if we were living in something approximated normalcy. But it didn't last long because then we started Heydrich was killed. Heydrich was the boss of Moravia and Bohemia, the German. I don't know what they call. They called German Bohemia ein Protektorat. They protected this. This was under the German protection. Had a special status, which had consequences in Auschwitz, because we were in a Familienlager. We were in a family camp because we came from the Protectorate. We were not German citizens. So this boss was assassinated. And then they went looking for traitors and marched into our homes in the middle of the night in full uniform. One night was a particular nightmare. They went through the children's mattresses. They chased my father out. Then we had to wear the yellow star. All this, I'm sure you've heard so many times. The thing that I remember about the yellow star, that you could go out only at specific hours, I think between 3 and 5 in the afternoon. And then I walked on the street near our house with a yellow star and bumped into something that felt like metal and heard a snarling animal turn on me. It was a German officer with an artificial arm, and I had bumped him. And here I had this, he knew I was Jewish, I had the yellow star on me, and he turned on me. I thought that was the end of me. I mean, there was just no hope. I just stood there staring at him, totally immobilized, and waited. He already walked, and I was still standing there. He snarled and yelled at me. I had touched his arm. Then my father went to mikveh every morning, and one day he didn't come back. He disappeared for 24 hours, and then miraculously they sent him back again. Then the holidays, Rosh Hashanah, came around, and they had to pray together secretly. And there was a raid, and my father was reading the Torah, and somebody came in and said, the Gestapo is coming. So all he did is put on his Jude armband. That's all he felt. That was. It was like a continued terror, and at the same time a valiant and effort to maintain a Jewish life. For example, every Shabbos we had to have meat, so we certainly didn't have any meat. I remember weeks when we had a pigeon. Somehow you could get a pigeon and shecht it, and then my mother would stuff it with bread or something and fry onions to get at least a smell and a reminiscence of a Shabbos meal into the house. When Passover came, my father was grinding flour on a hand mill to make matzahs, and my sister and I took turns at the window looking outside whether anybody's coming. For weeks, it took time to get that ground in this manner. There were people hanging was an everyday occurrence for black market deals. What they call black market, you see, we had a certain allowance rations. And the rations, if you had really adhered to the rations, you would have died within a week. There was absolutely no way you could live on what they had rationed for us. So we had to buy black. At the same time, even if you went out to buy on the black market, there were lines starting early in the morning, and we couldn't get out until 3 in the afternoon, so that by the time we came out, there was no more food. So unless the Czechs worked with us and kept some food for us, as one grocer on our street did, we would have starved. When we did get some food, we hid it in the cellar under the coal. Now, coal wasn't permitted either. You were not allowed to have coal for your houses. I remember every Friday night when the candles would dim, we had a big Kacheloven. It was this beautiful old house, and in the corner, like Kidder corner, was tile stove from ceiling to bottom, and it had a glass door, and the embers, it would stay for 24 hours. The embers would glow, and when the candles were extinguished, usually hungry by that time, the pigeon didn't go too far, and we stood warming ourselves and against that tile oven, and with I had such a passionate desire to make time stand still, because tomorrow was so dangerous, and this was a little peace and a little glow and a little warmth, a little Shabbos glow. And then there was Lidice. We knew that our people were being deported to Theresienstadt, to Terezin. And that was so close by. It was about 2 hours from Prague. And at first, we thought, well, all right, we'll be close to home as soon as the war is over. We'll just, in 2 hours, we're back home. Which was totally absurd, because they took everything away from us. We had to deliver our silver. We had to give up everything we had piecemeal. And then we lived in this apartment with about 5 families, and tempers were so short. There was so much fighting and resentment among ourselves, because 5 hungry housewives in the kitchen trying to cook up something for their families. 5 families maneuvering to get some black market food. And we thought, it's just Theresienstadt, that's not so far away. And then there was Lidice, and I don't know if Lidice means anything to you. That was a Czech village that was completely annihilated after Heydrich was shot. And word got back to us that our boys, or our people in Theresienstadt, were brought to Lidice to bury the dead. And they provided some graphic detail, like that the animals were lowing and barking and squealing, that when they came to the village there was a cacophony of animal sounds, which was the only thing left of the village. They killed women and children and men, everybody, the whole village was annihilated. And that sort of, I think, accelerated our perception of where we were going.
When you say our people, was that...
The Jewish boys were brought by truck to Lidice to bury and clean up.
So your impression of what Theresienstadt was about changed, you're saying?
Not only that, I think the German potential for barbarity suddenly, you know, everything, war, okay, there's war, there's labor camps and war. This was still within the realm of imagination. But Lidice was different. Lidice was a glimmer of something. We had no reliable news from Polish ghettos. We didn't know anything about Auschwitz, but we did know about in Theresienstadt. We knew there was no food there. But it was close to home. That was sort of comforting. I think what what is amazing is the constant reverting to some semblance of normalcy that was going on. It's like an instinct. What stands out to me in a later labor camp of entering a deserted barracks, it was already the 5th labor camp, I lost count of where I had been. What stands out in my mind is a little woman. She looked very old, but she probably was 35, because at that point, that's how he looked. And it was dirty. And she stepped out, and we stood at the door, hungry and in shock and cold. And she stood there for a minute, and then she stepped out, broke off a branch of an evergreen, and started sweeping. It stands in my mind as a symbol of what we constantly did, constantly reverting to some normalcy, constantly creating something livable, like the pigeon. Or you couldn't go out very far with a boy, but I met a boy at I studied English from a Mrs. Lynch, who had married a Jew, an Irish lady, and she gave English lessons for a few weeks. And I was her star pupil. She adored me. And I met somebody, I met a woman there in whose house I met a boy. He came up to our house. He had asked me a few times to go for a walk with him. There's very little else, and I said I couldn't. My father wouldn't allow that. And one day he showed up in our house, and then my father confronted him like an old-time prophet, and here was this guy without a hat, looking like a goy. And he said, I'd like to go for a walk with your daughter. And I thought, I'm going to die. My father's going to throw him out and throw him down the stairs. And for some reason, my father was very thoughtful, and then he said, all right, which was absolutely incredible. And he opened up a whole world to me. They were one of those super intellectual and artistic Viennese family. I went to his house. His mother they had an art collection, and they met the intelligentsia from the Viennese coffee houses assembled in Prague in their house, and it was so exciting. And to this day, I have a surge of love for my father, for his sensitivity in granting me that much. He would have never permitted that under normal circumstances, and how alien and obnoxious this must have seemed to him. And out of his love, he gave that. I also had a friend from Vienna who was such a revelation to me, because she said she doesn't know how she ever got here, because her grandfather wanted to convert, but he thought he was a Viennese, officer. But he said it wouldn't be nice at a time when Jews are being persecuted, so he's waiting for good times. So at this point, 3 generations later, she was still Jewish and ended up in Theresienstadt with us. And she thought I was very exotic, and I thought she was exotic. And it gave... What I'm trying to say is that we didn't spend our time in constant, unmitigated misery. We didn't have enough to eat, and we were scared to go out, and every now and then people we knew were hanged in the park, in the public place, and in between we snatched some romance and some pleasure and of course rumors, delicious rumors of how the Germans are losing and how we're going to be liberated soon, and until the transports became faster and faster.
So all this time you were still in Prague?
Prague. And every day we spent in Prague, we said, thank God, if the war's over, we're right here, we're home. By that time we had nothing much anymore, but I was in a new trade. Now I knew how to sew corsets. I would sew money into the you know, the stays that went into the corsets. I would wind money around them, and I was very good at that. I did that for lots of people, and of course for ourselves, and of course I didn't know that they would take all our things away, so all that money neatly sewn was
Like your
taken away.
position in the family must have changed a lot then. You weren't just a bookish,
Wasn't that amazing?
practical person. You really were.
I was so
the person who had to
practical.
survive.
They had it both ways. To this day I'm wondering about it. They had it both days. They put me down and put me in charge. They said I was a useless intellectual and why don't I make a living? They didn't say that, it was implied. Of course they didn't want me to make a living. But it was understood. Who else was going to do it? By default, I had to do it. And I did it so well, I can't believe it. Because I was really impossible. I remember shortly before we went to Prague, my mother said I should wash my stockings. So obediently I washed my stockings. Normally I didn't do that. And I rubbed my whole skin off on that stocking. They absolutely didn't know how to do anything except read. What an unlikely candidate for survival I am. I'm here, I'm going to be 61 years old. I don't know how I even made it to Theresienstadt. Never mind afterwards.
When were you sent to? When were you sent to Theresienstadt?
In 42. In 42, we finally, I mean, I don't even know how we stayed on so long. It was blind luck. It must have been like a lottery. And in 42, there were so few Jews around. At that point, it had to come, and we did. And now I'm starting to block. Because what I remember very clearly is that my father, we knew they were going to cut his beard. So he decided, his friends suggested that he cut his beard before he went to the Sammelplatz, you know, to the place where we assembled with our 22 kilo or whatever it was. I don't want to say because I don't remember the exact
But you had
amount.
been told up.
Yeah.
And that was part of it, was that his beard would be cut.
They said when he gets there, they'll cut off his beard. And he decided, why should the Nazis cut off his beard? That it would be permissible under these circumstances for him to have a friend cut his beard. And that stands out to me as the trauma of the day. Because he went into the bathroom and he came out shorn, and the sight was so shocking and so utterly devastating that my mother cried and we children howled. His naked face, those big eyes, I can still see that. And then we went to, lined up with our packs marked. And we slept one night in a huge room, like the armory here, with our bundles and waiting for the next day to get to Theresienstadt.
Did you know where you were going?
No, but we thought we were going to Theresienstadt. The first time I wore slacks. I was permitted to wear slacks, that it would be better if I slept on the ground. And what I remember at night, there was a lot of fooling around, a lot of false hilarity, a lot of sleeping around in that room, which was both exciting and terribly scary to me, because I had obviously had a very sheltered existence. What I left out now is that my boyfriend volunteered to come along. which is a very deep pain to me, because while we stayed in Theresienstadt, he was immediately shipped off to Poland. He didn't want to be separated, and he felt that sooner or later he would have to go too, and so he thought he would rather go with me, with us. Couldn't even tell my parents about it, because while they may have permitted me to go for a walk, this was taking it too far. And I had no influence on that, but I saw him the last time at that Sommerplatz.
That night was, that night is very memorable too.
Yeah, he wasn't there. He was, when I saw him coming, he was jubilant. He made it into the same transport.
He must have cared about you very deeply.
Mm-hmm. For years, I felt so responsible for that. It was a barrack town for the Czech army, and they used to have about 5,000. If they had filled up the whole place, they would have had about 5,000 soldiers there, though they put in 50,000 Jews. Put bunk beds, 40 people to a little room. Thank you so much. Women in one building, men in another, and the food, such as it was given out like in the army, you know, is there with your cup and you got your food. Every room had Älteste, you know, like somebody responsible, right? And right away this shifting for some normalcy started. Of course, the terrible thing was that the place was just so full of infectious diseases. I mean, you just needed, at one point, conjunctivitis broke out. Everybody got it. There was no hygiene. There was very little care, and everybody was undernourished. So when you had conjunctivitis in one eye, if you went to the I forgot what they called it, you know, where there was a nurse or a doctor in a room, you got it in the other eye because they infected you promptly. I had conjunctivitis for weeks and weeks, and everybody looked at was squinting and running. The worst of it, opening your eyes in the morning because you got cake tight, you didn't have any water. Then dysentery. We spent nights and nights and nights waiting in line in the toilet and half the time not making it. Everything like spread like wildfire because we were so crowded. But immediately what I remember was that actually I moved when I think about it. Like you only had a blanket, made a skirt out of the blanket in order not to wear the same thing all the time. Some ingenious ways of embellishing your appearance, or we had I promptly had a boyfriend there too. There was something like a theater. There were very famous artists in Theresienstadt that had been deported from Vienna, from other famous operas. So they banded together and produced operas. They didn't have any props, they only had a few chairs, and whoever had to sing an aria would stand up and sing the aria, and if there was a duet, two people stood up. And somebody accompanied them on their untuned piano, but the voices were heavenly. Now, when something like this was done, you tried to get in, and there were thousands of people, so I stood in line hoping to get in to hear Samson and Delilah. And there was this boy who came up to me and said he had tickets. That's how I met him. But I remember that he was from a small Czech village, and there was a lot of intermarriage there, and these people got packages from home, which we of course didn't get. So for my 20th birthday, he got something we called a Krapfen, a big jelly donut. And he cut it in half, and he made, out of margarine and sugar, he made a beautiful birthday cake, and it was my name and 20 on it. He came with that. And my mother was so upset. My mother was upset that he's giving away his package. She says I shouldn't accept it. And I was really going to accept it. And we had a whole hassle about that. My mother said he should keep it. Does his mother have enough, and he should eat it himself? And he said he worked so hard on it and he wanted me to have it. Well, I did. We shared it. We decided we would share it. But it's like typical for the kind of ingenuity and the... he wasn't going to see another jelly donut for the rest of his life. This was like... He was a musician, and he played in that improvised band they had for show in Theresienstadt. That's why he had tickets to Samson and Delilah. I will never forget the mezzo-soprano. I have never heard anything before or since. It was absolutely magnificent. I can still hear it. We all stood. Of course, you wouldn't take space away for chairs, so the whole audience of a few hundred stood in this room, which was, at other times, it served as a prayer house. And there were those few chairs, and when she stood up, when everybody stood there with the eyes closed in order to fill in the scenery and the magic of an operatic stage. I can just see her in front of me. She was a supreme artist. This boy wrote an operetta called Das Ghetto-Mädchen, the Ghetto Girl. And it had some, it was really like an American operetta. It held all these love songs and the dances, and the whole production took about 2 hours, and that was performed. Then it was a French club. I belonged to a Spanish club. There was all kind of, all, you know, on an empty stomach and in a corner of one of the barracks or whatever.
So you kept up all your intellectual interests, or a lot of...
It didn't have any books. It had all to be verbally. The saving grace of that place was that we had Czech gendarmes guarding us, so that some information filtered in. A lot of these gendarmes were intermarried with Jewish women, so they smuggled in information, letters, sometimes some food. But basically we were starving, and the transports to Poland were going on. And my father was so weak. My sister and I saved up our bread ration. We didn't eat for quite a while, and we exchanged it for glucose. There were some doctors brought in, you know, deported to Theresienstadt, and they had brought in glucose in small vials because it was so rich in nutrition. They figured if they don't get enough to eat, they would have that. So we would trade our ration for glucose for my father. And then started having connections for my Zionist youth group. I knew somebody who was in charge of weighing the margarine. We used to get a little piece of margarine, and there was a central place where we would cut it into these small pieces, margarine and a little bit of sugar, which was part of our ration. And he arranged for me to be able to do that, which was like being appointed you're appointed chairman of the board of IBM. I was the envy of my room. Now I ate margarine and sugar all day so that I wouldn't have to eat my food and could give it to my family. I got so sick of it. It was incredible, but that's all I ate for weeks on end. And then one day I stole a whole case of margarine. And that was a very stupid thing to do, because they would have killed me. But I saw an opportunity, and I didn't take it to my bunk. I took it to a boy I knew whose father was the chief rabbi, Rabbi Ungar. He was like chief rabbi of Theresienstadt, the Germans. And nobody would ever search his room. He lived in a privileged room. And that's where I hid it and gradually sold it, bartered it for other food to feed the family. And the Theresienstadt was ruled by the Judenrat. The Nazis appointed a group of Jews to be in charge. And at the head of it, the Judenälteste, as he was called, was a gentleman called Jakob Edelstein, whom we knew from before. He had been very active in Zionist work. He was collecting in Reichenberg for Zionist causes before the war. And for quite a while, he protected us from the transport. What happened in the meantime is that when somebody became pregnant, of course, that was a death sentence. And in the ghetto, I think a lot of pregnancies secretly came to term and children were delivered. Some people fled, and instead of sending posses out to find them, this was shushed up. Anyway, after a while, this is in retrospect, I know that the count, we were counted regularly. The count didn't jibe anymore. Edelstein had protected too many Jews. And one day in the morning, we were all chased out of the ghetto, out of the barracks, into a big open field like a kettle. It was indented. And everybody, all 50,000, out into that field, and in a great hurry. And we were asked to line up for counting. And a whole day, we stood around in that meadow, and there were planes flying low over us. And of course, we all felt that this was the end. They were going to bomb us. And we clung to each other and waited from morning till night. And all of a sudden, in the pitch dark, there was the order to go back. It was so dark that I held my sister by one hand, my mother on the other, just not to lose them, back into the ghetto. And then they deported Edelstein and his son and wife and mother-in-law and shot them in Auschwitz. We heard later when we came there, because he had, the count didn't jibe. Somebody must have tipped them off. Well, there went our protection. And the next transport, I forgot something. Before Edelstein was caught, we got notification for the transport, just my mother and father. So we went to Edelstein to plead to change it, so that my sister and I could go instead of our mother and father. And we explained that we were strong and healthy and we could go to a labor camp. We didn't know it was Auschwitz, or that there was such an Auschwitz, but Edelstein seemed to have known. And that's why he wanted to send my parents rather than us. And he had to fulfill his quota of a certain amount of people. And we made this plea to go instead of my parents, and he went berserk. He got so excited. He was a very soft-spoken, fine gentleman. He got so excited. He said, "Will you leave me alone?" He said something like, "We're not substituting horses for the people who don't go. I have to send Jews. What do you want from me? I'm not making any changes." And we insisted and we cried, we want to go instead of our parents, and our parents weren't strong enough to go, and so on, and he threw us out, but he changed it. We My parents also didn't go. But then he was gone, and that's when we went. After he was gone, that was the end.
So all together this time.
I can't deal with Auschwitz. I'll do the best I can. The thing was that 3 months before, they had sent 5,000 people to Auschwitz. I'm trying to avoid talking about how we got there. It was just to describe an inferno. It's just impossible to describe the terror, the dark night, and the dogs, and the other. I felt frozen. I didn't think it was possible. It just didn't seem possible. It just knocked on your consciousness, and you couldn't let it in. There was a screaming. There was the couples and there was an insane screaming. You hear this in an insane asylum. And dogs barking and these inhuman guys standing there. And children crying and dark and And the next thing it just couldn't be understood. It couldn't be even incorporated. It was the end of the world. It was the end of the world. It was all nightmares wrapped in one. It couldn't be. And then lining up to be tattooed. Tattooing people. I mean, tattooing it. And then there stood this big Nazi in uniform, and next to him this gorgeous Jewish girl, beautiful, beautiful young girl, who looked well nourished, who looked different. She looked like normal. She was not in uniform, she was dressed properly. And it took me a long time to understand who she was. And as I came up, I was so, it's part of my history that I'm in charge. I'm in charge of my family, so I didn't let my mother go first. I would go first for the tattooing so she could see I was tattooed, and then my mother, and then my sister. Whenever there was, later when we went before Mengele, I was always first. And I promised my mother if he sends her off, I would join her. And she didn't refuse. I'm puzzled to this day. Anyway, we stood there, we came up to this beautiful girl, and she was doing the tattooing. And she whispered to me, when you survive, you're going to wear a thick bracelet, so it won't show. Cry about the brutality, but I cry about that kindness. And I said to her, and I hope you'll survive. And she said that can't be, and it couldn't be. Because the way she looked, I'm sure she was a mistress of this guy, and that's why she was nourished and dressed. And none of these ever left. Okay. came in, we were not separated on arrival, neither children nor anybody. Everybody went as we came into the family camp. And there we found 5,000. We came 5,000 in this transport, women and children and men. And there we found 5,000 people from Theresienstadt, our friends and relatives who had preceded us 3 months before. And I found the boy there, the musician, and he looked like a 80-year-old man. He shuffled. The men were in some barracks, and the women were in the others. From those who had been 3 months, the women looked much better than the men. The men looked emaciated, demasculated. They dripped from their noses, and they'd even tried to wipe themselves. It was a small compound surrounded by electric wires, and we spent 6 months in that. After people who had preceded us the gas ovens were right nearby, and the smoke pushed out like an angry fist day and night. After 3 months, we were 10,000 in that camp. After 3 months, those who had preceded us were gassed. So we knew when our turn came, because Germans are very orderly. It's just about my birthday. This was the time when our 3 months would be up. So we actually spent, 6 months. Their 6 months were up in March. That's when they were gassed. And our 6 months would be up in June. We had arrived on December 6th, 5th or 6th, I don't know. I'm confused between 5th and 6th because I came to America on December 6th. It may have been both December 6th.
That was what year?
We came in 43. This was in June. Our date for gassing was in June 44. I actually spent 3 months knowing exactly when I would die, which is something to live with for the rest of your life. I think when you called me, you said about dying many times. I thought about it afterwards. I've died so many times, I'm bound to die anticlimactically when my time comes. I had a friend there. Her name was Helenka, a Czech friend. And we used to sit. The thing is, they didn't let us do anything, just sat and wait to die. And then they had these bands playing in the evening, and they were dancing. The Nazis, the capos. The capos were political prisoners, were criminals, murderers. And they slept with our pretty girls, danced with them, gave them gonorrhea, and killed them afterwards. My mother was in constant fear somebody might spot me. Crazy. It was crazy. It was so insane. Wouldn't believe it that we're dying. There was a guy there who could read your palm. He read everybody's palm and said that we had a long lifeline and none of us were going to die. Did you hear it? That went around, this great rumor. It get me so angry. I was so furious. And there was an epidemic of, I wasn't going to be cheated out of dying. I felt that was the only thing left to me. If I couldn't live, at least die. You're talking yourself out of dying, I felt. If you believe these things, at least know that you're dying, and at least die as the only gift life still has to offer. I had an impetigo on my, there was an, I think you call it impetigo, I don't know. There was like an epidemic of impetigo there, so I had one on my cheek. I still have a tiny scar there. My mother saw that. Oh my God, my beautiful child. She started crying. What if this spreads on your beautiful face? What's going to happen? I said, Mommy, they're going to let me into the gas chambers with impetigo, I promise you. What a cruelty. You shouldn't talk like this. It's not allowed. It's not allowed. You have to hope. You're a Jewish child. You talk like a goy. She was fussing over this little blister on my face. And then I had Helena. Helena and I seemed to be the only people who fully experienced dying. We knew it. And we sat there and we tried to reconstruct poetry. Who can remember poetry? And we would work on it so hard to reconstruct some poetry to keep us for those few months. And there was one poem by Jiří Winter. It's a Czech poet who died when he was 25 years old of consumption. And his poem started, I'm not afraid of death. It is just a long sleep. And we reconstructed the whole poem, and then he said, he's a big liar. He was scared. Behind the electric fence, the Hungarian Jews started arriving in thousands and masses, and they stayed about 2 days, then they were gassed. And they had their babies, and then they took away their babies, and the women stood there bellowing from pain because they were so full of milk, and screaming like animals for their babies. We went up to the fence, and with it all I remember a guy flirting with me from across the fence. He wanted me to remember where he came from in case he survived. I should get in touch with him. How this life always, in all that bellowing, the few days he was there, he would stand there waiting for me and waving. He was nuts too. And then there was this long debate whether to leave the children or not. That come later. It turned out what actually happened in the meantime is that a good part of Germany was destroyed and they couldn't handle the rubble. So apparently they negotiated to have 2,000 able-bodied men and women come from our camp to Germany to clean up the rubble. We didn't know that. But there was a rumor that we were going to leave, which is the kind of rumor that kept coming all the time, because we knew that nobody had ever left Auschwitz. Nobody had ever left Auschwitz. This was crazy. And yet they started they started looking us over, picking out 2,000. And we were going to leave. And they didn't pick my mother. And I have to confess that I arranged with the Judenälteste to change a ticket so that my mother could come with me. And I will never know whom I sentenced to death by that. Because I was terribly, terribly persuasive. And she was an old prostitute and tough as they come. But she did it. My sister and I were chosen, and then I have, this goes to the very core of my pain. I was pleading with my father to push himself. There was a pushing and a shoveling going on to be out, and he wouldn't push and shove. And I remember yelling at him. Norman says, "You know Yiddish." Do you know Yiddish? I said, "Stip dich zu der Leibedecke. Ich bete dir, stip dich zu der Leibedecke." No way. No way. And while I hoped for years that he would be alive after the war, I knew it wasn't going to be. So we were ready to leave. And we went to say goodbye to my father. And he cried. And he put his hands on us, and he blessed us with a priestly blessing, the way the Kohanim do. That's the last time we saw him. My father took to martyrdom as if he had an old familiarity with it. It was God's will, and that's all there was to it. It wasn't the first time. It was probably not the last time that this happened to Jewish people, and it has to be accepted with love of God. He was better at dying than at living, and I resented it. I wanted him to be that aggressive to live. He prepared for Passover for months, exchanging his bread for potato, until he assembled enough potatoes to last through the 8 days of Passover in Auschwitz. Yet he encouraged the children to eat everything we could.
Kept the kashrut even in the camp?
Yeah, in Auschwitz. He ate a potato a day for the 8 days of Pesach, and insisted that we eat everything. He was not despondent. He only cried when he said goodbye to us. This was God's will. Speaking of God's will, I've been tortured by dialogue with God for the rest of my life. I can't make meaning of it. left the camp, we went for a few days. We stayed in the Frauenlager, in the women's camp. There was like a new version of the Inferno. There were women there who had survived years in Auschwitz by, who knows what means, by putting the bodies into the crematoria or being prostitutes or whatever. And they were rabid lesbians, and as we walked in, one of them chucked me under the chin like she was going to look me over, and my mother attacked her like a fury. Let go, pushed her aside. We were put into, there were these tall tier beds. These women were crazy. They screamed, they yelled, they hit. It was like another insane asylum. And then we were put into wagons, and most of us, I think at this point, thought that we're going to the crematorium. And the train started moving. Incredibly, the trains moved, and we were completely enclosed, like in cattle cars. Tiny slits. We looked out and started seeing signs of cities. I remember Katowice, little Polish signs. It blew your mind. We were actually leaving. There was no such thing. It was a whole reconstruction. I mean, I was dead. I had really already died. And here was actually, there was a world outside. It took a whole adjustment. Disbelief. Incredulity. And the trains kept rolling and rolling, and there were more signs, and then it settled, and going out, leaving Auschwitz. An incredible thought, like more than nowadays would be to come to a new galaxy. That's nothing. That's technologically possible, but leaving Auschwitz is not possible. Stunned. Very thoughtful of you to provide tissues. Not far-fetched, but thoughtful. We were 500 women, and the 500 women now stayed together. My mother, I didn't tell you going past Mengele. Interesting, still no courage. By the way, in Auschwitz, we were given dresses of people they had killed. We didn't have uniforms. In the Familienlager, this was one of our preferential treatments. You have to understand the German mind. We were not German citizens. They couldn't treat us as they wished. They gave us preferential treatment. The preferential treatment consisted of keeping us together in the Familienlager. That they killed us was incidental, and that they didn't put us in uniforms. So I was given a dress, a navy. I think that's the kind of thing that's probably valuable because it is so subjective and different. I was given a navy blue dress, which was probably the epitome of elegance in some Ukrainian village. It had all kind of fanciness on it. What we didn't get was underwear and got high-heeled shoes. I remember the high-heeled shoes because I was tripping naked in front of Mengele. I was hoping he was drunk, and if he would see how strong and healthy I was, my mother would slip through. If my mother was going to be sent to the left, I had promised her to go with her, and I was going to. And then my sister would have to do whatever she pleased. But when we first came and I had this dress and then I was menstruating, I had nothing. So I would tear off pieces from my navy blue velvet and silk dress to use in lieu of a napkin. And the dress got shorter and shorter and shorter because every month I had to use the napkins. The thing was that most people didn't menstruate in Auschwitz from malnutrition and whatever. But my sister and I were menstruating, and this was our way of dealing with it by pulling off pieces of the dress in the bottom until I had a mini skirt, which was very unpleasant. I had these high-heeled shoes as I was tripping past. I'm going back to something that is so painful that I'm trying not to move away from anything if I can, but I know when I get home I will realize that I have backed off. There were little children in the Familienlager, and I remember some of them so clearly. There was one that had been in our room in Theresienstadt, and then she was with us in Auschwitz. Her name was Evichka, a diminutive for Eva. And she was bright and precious and had a curly head of hair. And then there was a little boy, Yosicek. And the parents, when this started that we would leave, had to decide whether they're leaving the children behind. Otherwise they would have to get gassed with the children. Certainly no child left. Evichka somehow got wind of it, that she was going to be left behind, because her mother and father were young people. They were in their late 20s, and they were debating endlessly whether it was right for them to leave. They're young, they can have other children, whether they should stay. Mother's name was Gerda. Gerda said she wants to stay, she can't go. So the argument was, the child will still be murdered. What do you gain by it? And the little girl, who was exceedingly bright, caught on to the whole thing. And she kept saying, Gerda, she called her Gerda, Gerda, you're not going to leave me here, are you? You can't leave me here alone. I'm scared. Well, she carried on such a campaign that they stayed with her. Parents of the little boy, who was less vociferous and less demanding, although he was bright, he was more sensitive and retiring. A beautiful child with big black eyes. He was the apple of their eye. These people had been older when they got him. They left and left Yosicek behind. I remember when we were in Theresienstadt, Gerda would put the little girl into pajamas so she would feel her all over her body, whether her bones are sticking out. Is she getting too skinny? My youngest, Rena, has the same curly head, but she was little. Every time she walked away from me, I would have the other little girl in front of me. I can't forget her. We saw her in Vienna. The same alertness, the same curly head, the same way of moving. I believe the first stop in Germany was in Altona. We came to Hamburg. And we walked through the cities of Hamburg. A lot of it was destroyed. And we had uniforms, striped prisoners' uniforms. That was later. It was later. We went to Altona. Altona is the harbor of Hamburg. And there were lots of warehouses, wooden warehouses. And they stuffed the warehouses full with our people. And we were in one warehouse. And at that point, I don't know anymore who did what, but the English bombed that night and the Americans during the day or vice versa, but there was bombing around the clock. And they would lock us up into these, in the wooden warehouses, and the guards would go to the bunker, and we would stay there. And the wharves, the whole harbor was burning. There were direct hits on the warehouses. At that time, our guards were older men, because every able-bodied person was at the front. And they took off the minute the alarm sounded. They took off. And to get away from what they called the Christmas trees. Well, there were direct hits. The first night was another facet of the inferno. We had a bunch of Hungarian women with us who weren't used to this. You know, we were veterans. We had been through years of concentration camps. But they had just left. They came in late, and they were just fresh from home. Well, when the bomb started flying, and it was bright like in daylight, and the warehouses exploded, they started screaming. They were screaming each other's name, Ilonka and Shema Yisrael. They were screaming. The rest of us, there was a difference there. The rest of us just waited. And there was no way of calming them down. They rushed the door and almost broke the door down. There was a yelling and screaming that night that was absolutely deafening until the alarm was over. They had us there for a few nights, and then there was really nothing but our bunker left, from what I could tell. And then we marched on. It took us someplace else, and we marched. The next thing I remember, we were in several labor camps. We marched through the cities of Hamburg. The youngest of us was about 11, and the oldest may have been my mother, who was 48. And there were faces behind the curtains. And nobody said a word. Faces behind every seeing this march. This was in the middle of the winter. There was snow in the streets. And we wore those thin striped uniforms with splinters sticking out because the material was made of wood at this point. There was no more fabric. And the wind blew right through me. And it wasn't the wind, it was those faces. Looking, just curious. Sometimes Somebody would throw some food. Sometimes they would throw garbage, making us believe that it was food. When you went for it, caught it. I never went for it. I don't know whether I didn't run for it for any noble reason. I wasn't up to the competition.
What were your thoughts about this? Anger?
I don't think I had the energy to be angry at this point. I just felt, how is it possible? It's not the same species. You see, when you ask me, we went through stages. It's so hard, you know how you assimilate events and rework them in your memory. The shock of betrayal by Hildegard, you know, that's one stage. I'm betrayed. I'm betrayed. I loved her, and I thought she loved me. What is she doing? There's betrayal. Then there's the betrayal of the culture. My God, we believed in German Kultur. I was so knowledgeable in German Kultur. I'm so familiar with Goethe and Schiller. You won't find a German as enamored of it as I am. What's going on? They didn't mean it. Did I misunderstand the whole world? Then there's a betrayal of religion. You know, even in the shtetl, it seeped through from my parents that if you saw a religious guy, you didn't have to be afraid. If you met him on a dark street, if he was a real frommer guy, you didn't have to be afraid. My God, look at them. There must be a frommer guy in between them. What's happening? Everything's wrong. Everything I knew is wrong. Everybody's betraying me. Am I crazy? Everybody. And then there's my own God. What do I do with that? There's betrayal upon betrayal upon betrayal. Or am I misunderstanding? There's a struggle for meaning. I mean, Frankl touched on it, but we have lived it. What happened to the poetry? What happened to the churches? You know, I wasn't permitted to celebrate Christmas. I didn't think of celebrating Christmas, but Christmas was magic in Reichenberg. Church bells and trees and peace on earth. Hell, they didn't mean it. It was all betrayal. And then these faces there, what do they see? An 11-year-old child walking in this uniform. Where did they get so many gods from? Where did they find them? My poor mother, when she hit Reichenberg, and she said, as the train pulled in, there was a voice calling Reichenberger Zeitung, Reichenberg newspaper. It was like heavenly sounds. My God, I'm out of Poland, I'm among Germans. German people, polite, clean, decent, honest. You can trust them. They never hit a child like she was hit in Poland. Everything was betrayed. Everything was different. There's more. There are layers and layers of it. Layers of betrayals and struggle. So we went out of Altona. We went to something called Neugraben. We got up at the crack of dawn. Traveled by boats. We walked for miles to pick up rubble in the cities. I was looking for a way of keeping my mother home. I was afraid she wouldn't be able to take it. It was bitter cold, and I'd walk alone and then without decent clothing in wooden shoes. My feet were rubbed bloody for months and months and months. They were just steadily bleeding. In the morning when I had to protect my mother. I felt I had to pull her through. I had to pull her through as long as I was alive. And I had to take care of my sister. And I always felt, my God, I'm going to die of the effort. If I could just take care of myself, I might survive. But this way, nobody can do that. And now when I think back, I think that's what helped me survive. I had a mission. I had work to do. I think that's what helped me survive. Like we got up in the morning. There this syphilitic guy came in, 6.5 feet tall, all screaming up. She wasn't fast enough. So I'm shielding her, and he grabbed a chair and threw it at her, and I caught it with my leg. To this day, I have a hole in my bone here. It healed very nicely without ever being treated. He cracked my leg with a chair because I threw it out in front of my mother. Then we come to the truck. You have to get on a truck where they take us to the next place where we're going to walk on. She can't get on the truck. So I'm behind her, push her up and go on behind her. And then there's adaptation, like stealing food comes the next step. I went to the woman in charge of the camp and they said I knew how to sew brassieres. Now to get a brassiere in camp, I mean, that's a luxury. Who had a brassiere? Not even she. Well, she fell all over herself. Of course, there was no machine. I sewed it by hand after work. In exchange, she let my mother stay home and clean the barracks, which was, I don't have a comparison for the relief and the break this was. She stayed home most of the winter. Then my sister stayed home and I would sew at night by hand, made her bras.
Sounds like you always did have the common sense and the strength.
Nobody will believe it in the family. There's a stereotype that adheres to me. Well, Neugraben ended too, but I do remember from going to once coming into something that looked like Forest Hills in Hamburg. It was these high-rise buildings, a suburb with high-rise buildings, and there had been an attack the night before, and the asphalt had melted. And as people ran out, apparently, from the buildings, they got stuck in the asphalt and burned, just standing there. And there were small feet and big feet, like a record of that scene in the morning. I actually reprimanded myself for feeling sorry for them. That's how totally confused and chaotic the mind becomes at this point. Here I stood in front of this scene and visualized little kids getting stuck in the hot asphalt and burning to death, and I said, how dare you feel compassion for them? I have so many things to be grateful for. I survived in excellent health, but I've been aware of it from the minute I was free, that the greatest blessing is that I'm not dehumanized, because it was so easy to be dehumanized. In so many ways. When we came to Neugraben, it was out in the countryside, and it was heartbreakingly beautiful. It was a clear winter day. The snow crystals were sparkling, and every tree had a cap, a beret on. And the beautiful birches stood so tall. And the same feeling, the aesthetics of the landscape, the love of it. And how can you love this cursed landscape, the constant contradiction? In Neugraben, we stood for counting as we did throughout the years. And the commander took out three, what looked to him like the three strongest strapping girls to cut wood for cooking the soup. Of course, I was among them, which was a break in a way. Very weird thing. He had an allotment of wood for cooking for the prisoners, but he sold it. And then he took out three girls and told them to go into the woods and act like this. And if we wouldn't bring home, he made it perfectly clear, if we don't bring home enough wood, there will be no food tonight. And we wanted to chop down a pine tree. And Hannes told us a pine tree would be too wet in the middle of the winter. We should chop down birches. I have a think about birches. I was ashamed of it at the time, but it hurt me to cut down birches. It just hurt me to see all those stumps in the forest. But I cut down a lot of birches. We went out and he taught us how to make like a triangular cut, and mainly not to push the tree upon us, but down a hill. Our first impulse was to pull at the tree. And he supervised us, taught us how to cut wood. And we never missed a meal. We always brought the wood home. Of course, we had accidents, like carrying those big pieces of wood. We were sliding and falling. But it was so great to be outdoors and to have actually meaningful work, because the food for the camp depended on it. I must go back with the birches to Auschwitz. At one point, the pressure of, I sort of commanded myself not to get deluded by those fantasies that we were going to survive and so on. I had to be here and now. I had to experience what little life there was left. I would also say that what hurt most, I had such a desire to live, such a raging, raving desire to live. And what was at the core of this tremendous desire to live is to have a child. That I would die without having had a child. This was more important than anything else I could imagine. I don't know why this extreme deprivation I felt of dying without having had a child. But there it was. That was like the core of it. And at one point, the pressure of it became so strong that I did something inexplicable for myself, something therapeutic that I cannot explain, except that it came from a deeper knowledge than I have access to normally. The latrine was open. You were permitted to go to the latrine. Latrine was open, and it was the winter in Auschwitz, and it was cold. You cannot imagine how cold it was. You were always in a cloud from the steam from your mouth when you stepped out. And at a point of utter despair, I, like a sleepwalker, I went to that latrine, and there was nobody there. It was early. And I undressed completely and washed myself from top to bottom with snow. And I was red like a lobster. And I rubbed and rubbed with the snow. And at that point, I felt I wasn't going to die. I felt so vigorous, so in touch with with myself. I have no explanation for it, but I got dressed again and I felt strong and good. No idea why I did it or how it worked. But it was just a transcendent experience. I didn't tell anybody. I went back to my barracks. I felt warm. I wasn't hungry. I wasn't ruminating on keeping in mind that I'm dying. I was just there. I was. In one of the labor camps, I did go to work with my mother, and my mother and sister were in the camp, and they camp were, and we walked for miles, and as we were walking back, we saw fire in the distance, and we knew it was a camp. We knew the camp had had a direct hit. And we walked like condemned people. All conversation stopped. The guards and the dogs next to us. We walked and walked. In my mind, I said, I'm going to have to look at the corpses of my sister and mother now. And I steeled myself for it. Sure enough, when we got there, the mess hall was full of corpses covered. And our women were going from one to the other, lifting off the sheets, looking for their relatives. And then my sister and my mother came running. Hadn't hit where they had been. That march is something I'll live with. Next door to this camp was a camp for Italian prisoners of war, which were absolutely wonderful people. Whenever they could, they threw their packages across the wire. They flirted, they sang, they tried to cheer us up whenever they could communicate. And when the camp was hit, they bribed the guard with cigarettes and dashed into our camp to pull out the girls from the rubble. They saved quite a few of them. And the end of it was that we came to Bergen-Belsen. That was the last march. When we came to Bergen-Belsen, I have heard that they poisoned the food at this point. This was a week before liberation. We had bunks with 5 people sleeping next to each other. Where I slept, 3 were dead and 2 were alive. My mother and my sister didn't get out of bed anymore. They were just lying there. I went to look for food. I went into the kitchen to peel beets. And I took a beet, and the German saw me, and he threw me against the wall. I was not hurt. But there was no point anymore. You didn't have to steal beets anymore. It was finished. There was really nothing to do anymore. I couldn't persuade my sister to get up. My mother wasn't getting up. It was like the end of the road. And then one morning there was this, you heard shooting in the back, but you had in the background, but you had heard shooting in Auschwitz. How long can you hope? We had heard sound of shooting in Auschwitz. So And one morning, there they were, the British marched in. There was a truck, and there was a very exotic-looking guy on the front. He looked exotic to me because he was chubby. I hadn't seen a German or a Jew looking so well-nourished in 5 years. And he said, Uganda, Uganda, I think, I don't know, something in Polish. Attention, attention, you are free. We shall bring food. You are free. Incredible. Totally impossible to integrate. And then whoever was alive went to Bergen, out of Belsen, and to Bergen. I rallied rather quickly. I wasn't sick. And in Bergen, we lived in what had been the quarters for the Germans. So they were clean places, but what became apparent immediately that there was a typhoid epidemic among us. At first, a lot of us in the old camp, I'm advancing again. Before we were moved to Bergen, we were liberated, I believe, on Tuesday. Do you know how afraid I am to make a mistake on that? On Tuesday. On Friday, my mother suddenly had the idea that she has to light candles tonight. I was like, where did this idea come from? That's years back. But she knew it was Friday, and she resumed her responsibilities. And she said, you know English, go get me candles. So I tripped down the road, and there were so many corpses, they actually had to skip over the corpses looking for a British officer. And I saw one, and I went up to him in my best Irish accent, because Mrs. Lynch had been Irish. I found out later that I spoke with an Irish brogue, which was very peculiar, but that's what she had taught me, and I didn't know. And with this Irish best schoolgirl English, I said, please, sir, could I have some candles? And he was actually scared, because here was this scarecrow in uniform speaking Irish English and wanting candles. And he said, why do you need candles? And I said, for ritual purposes. So he said, don't leave. Don't leave. Come with me. So we both tripped over the bodies, and we came to a truck. And he said I should come into the truck with him. Well, I reminded him of the candles, and he promised me I would get the candles. I said, my mother really wants candles. And he promised he would take care of the candles. Would I just come into the truck with him? And he will just talk to me because he would like to know what happened to me, where I come from. So I did. And that was a BBC truck, and he was a Labour MP called Patrick Gordon Walker. And he broadcast directly from Bergen-Belsen. So he asked me for my name and where I came from, my parents' name, and where I had been, and then suddenly, well, tell me about it. So I started talking. And I don't think I was aware that I was telling any very unusual stories, because by now this was my life. And suddenly, this man took out this big white handkerchief. And that had an enormous impact on me, because a white handkerchief, and he started mopping his eyes. And all kind of things occurred to me. First of all, I saw his nails. They were beautifully manicured nails, and I realized my own nails were broken and dirty. And I suddenly became aware of myself as a girl, which I hadn't experienced for such a long time, and I was mortified. I felt this white handkerchief and his fingernails were too much. And why was he crying anyway? So he told me to continue, and I did. And then he closed off and repeating that this is BBC, and he was broadcasting from Bergen-Belsen and so on. And I reminded him of the candles. Well, he took me to the chaplain, and I got candles and a prayer book, which I still own, which I inscribed in rather faulty English to remember where it came from. What happened was that BBC broadcasted in England, and some people from Reichenberg heard it and got in touch with my uncle in New York. And that's how they found out that we were alive. And I got mail, and we started getting involved in arranging for our trip to America. It was like a transatlantic incident.
Your mother wanted eventually.
Yeah, well, she got her candles. I mean, there's no denying mother candles. Patrick Gordon Walker died a few months ago, and I can't understand that I never got in touch with him, that I never asked for the tape. But it is part of my unfortunate tendency to try and not dwell on it, try to live my life, try not to. I don't think it's the best method, but I do the best I can. Well, then we were in Bergen, and I started haunting the British, whatever, little headquarters I had there for Red Cross lists of who had survived, looking for my relatives, for my father mainly. And I became acquainted with some British officers in this. While I was doing that, there were lots of people doing that, looking for the list, but I spoke English. And one of the officers told me later how stunned he was when he heard the Irish brogue. But nevertheless, I was a very useful person. I could speak to almost anybody of the survivors, and there was a great effort to find out where people had been, where they came from, where their relatives were. Now, I knew German and Spanish and English, and I knew Czech, so I understood Polish and Russian to some extent, and I knew Yiddish, so I was in demand. I also developed a rather strong and inappropriate attachment to one of the British officers who had such a deep understanding of me that he spent hours and hours and hours trying to reconstruct for me what had happened while I was dead. Well, I didn't know about an invasion, I didn't know about Japan, I didn't know about anything that had happened for years. I hadn't seen a newspaper, I didn't know what date it was for years. And this young man had a sense of this and felt so frustrated by it that he literally reconstructed a few years for me. And he got very upset if I couldn't keep it straight, because he felt it like a mission, that he wanted to make up for this, which was again something that flavored my existence, this relationship with this young officer. So grateful to him. I mean, at that crucial time, to give me a sense of myself, of my worth, of my being a girl. It was just priceless. But of course, other things happened. We had a typhoid epidemic, and 28,000 people died among our survivors who were there. But what occurred to me on a day-to-day basis, that I suddenly realized that my mother and sister had typhoid, and that the enemy now was our own people, because the British didn't have enough medication. They gave blankets and food, inappropriate food, in the sense that it was too heavy for some people. Died drinking that heavy milk, that condensed milk. Our stomachs couldn't take anything like this. There was a lot of goodwill, but very limited things, limited blankets, limited food, and they couldn't deal with the epidemic at all. So the only thing they could do was separate the sick from the healthy to contain the spread of the disease. And of course, in that, our people cooperated fully because they wanted to survive. But what happened to me now was that I had to protect my mother and sister from our own people, who, if they had realized that they were sick, would have told them. Told the British, who came with stretchers twice a week to collect the sick, and you never saw anybody back again. When they took them away, nobody came back. Could I have some more water?
We're running out of time also, so I've been given a signal for another, have another 10 minutes.
You know, the farmhouses in which we were stored had had an attic. It was a typically German farmhouses had an attic with a heavy metal door, and that's where I took my mother and sister and hid them in the attic. And this was my mother was delirious and screamed. I had to cover her up with a pillow so she wouldn't be hurt and they wouldn't take her away. My sister was comatose. She was quiet. Every few minutes I would put my chest to her to see whether she was still breathing. My rations, I couldn't feed them the rations. They were inappropriate. They were too heavy. So I would go at night through the wire that surrounded the fence to the farmhouses in the area and barter my rations for fresh milk, for cereal, and feed them there. And then my mother developed a decubitus, you know, her skin. She got terrible skin sores from lying on that rough sheet that I had there. I was desperate. It was turning black and rotting. It looked like gangrene. I didn't know what to do, so I ran outside and I saw a friend on the street, and she was going with an officer. He turned out to be an Irish volunteer, and he was a doctor. I realized from his instinct that he was a doctor. So I went up to them and I said, "You just have to help me. My mother is in the attic, and there's this, she has this terrible sore on her back. I don't know what to do." And I started crying, and this beautiful man came with me, sneaked up into the attic, and cleaned her wound, came every day. Cleaned her wound. He didn't give her whatever he gave her, I don't know what he had, and took care of them. This went on for weeks. At one point, I heard church bells, and there was great jubilation outside. The war was over. And I sat halfway between the attic and the second floor and looked out the window and all that screaming and hollowing, and it's too late for me. It's too late for me. I don't give a damn. I knew I was going to bury my mother and sister single-handedly. The whole thing was useless. It had been a struggle for naught. I don't give a damn whether the war is over or not. I went back to take care of my mother and sister. I didn't even go outside. They both recovered. First time I took my sister out, she got like this, and she got totally drunk from the air. I had kept her in that attic so long. She couldn't breathe normal air. I had to sort of drag her along the street, but I kept going out every night looking for. At one point I got strawberries. It was like a miracle. I hadn't seen a strawberry. I couldn't even remember what it was. Strawberries with cream, I fed her. And she got well. And when they were well, we went under auspices to Sweden.
Did you and your mother and your sister, did you discuss as you went along, you know, how much you were we were sticking together? Was it?
What else would we have done? Who wouldn't have stuck together? There was a lot of sticking together even among strangers. You needed some human support. Funny thing is, Norman married a girl whose mother I saw in Sweden. She's also a survivor. When I met my new Machetenste, I recognized her as one who was dragging two younger sisters along. She was like a mother hen, and those two younger sisters were always behind her. There are many ways of, somewhere you have to make some human connection. And I'm sure she did all she could to help them survive.
You wanted to bear witness.
Yes, the wish to bear witness was overwhelming when I survived. At one point, a friend of mine and I went to the British PR man, whoever he was called, and we said we wanted to get in touch either with Bromsfield or Steinbeck. We wanted to talk to an author because we wanted to tell him. And he just said yes, yes. It was one of the crazy ideas of the survivors, and he brushed us off. But when I resumed my life, I didn't want any more. It was so painful. I just wanted to get on with things. I didn't want to dwell on it. I'm glad that I've done this. I find that the Holocaust business has become very shrill and slightly off-putting to me. On a historical level, what it seems to me, I mean, this may be far-fetched, but it seems to me as if we had really bought the emancipation as Jews, and we're screaming at the world, hey, what'd you do to us? You promised us. You said we were equals, and we're citizens, and we're people. All of a sudden, you're turning back on your promise. I don't think they ever promised us to be equals. I think my father's perspective has some historical validity. He felt it has happened before, and somehow we maneuver ourselves into a situation where it happens again. And our shrillness is related to this historical movement, which has deviations. I don't know if it's going on. I don't know if that's a straight line from emancipation to true equality for Jews. It isn't. It probably isn't. I struggle with that. Where is it? Do we say, hey, do we present this bill of goods to the world and say, hey, you betrayed us, you promised something and you haven't kept your word? Or do we pull in and say, these things are endemic to our particular historical style. How can we protect ourselves? I think it's a safer thing to do. I feel exposed and slightly ludicrous being shrill about the Holocaust. I think that many well-meaning people think it's gone too far. It's gone too far. Some of the decent Germans said, this is really too much. But they didn't say it was wrong. That's really too much, I mean, to kill people in concentration camps. I think the feeling, with exceptions, of course there are a lot of decent people in the world, with exceptions the feeling is, in Germany it went too far. That's all. So I feel, as far as I'm concerned, I would like my children to know that it's a historical event of huge proportions, bigger. But I think at the time of the Inquisition it was of the same proportions. It's not unprecedented. It's just that there are no more people and more technology. It's not unprecedented. It's not impossible to recur. What to do about it? I don't know if screaming blue murder is the answer. I'm not sure. If you ask me in 5 years, maybe I know more.
Put that over.